previous lectures, we learned how to draw Lewis structures. And from Lewis structures and VSEPR theory, valence shell electron pair repulsion theory, we were able to determine the shape of a molecule. And then from the shape of a molecule combined with the ideas of electronegativity and the bond polarity, we were able to determine the molecular polarity of a molecule, whether a molecule is polar or nonpolar. Finally, the molecular polarity will determine what we call intermolecular forces. And this is a very important idea that can explain to us why this molecule, ethylene, is a gas at room temperature, but if you connect a whole bunch of ethylenes together, it will be a solid. That is essentially what plastic is. Plastic is a bunch of ethylenes all connected to each other. So why would it be that this would be a gas at room temperature, whereas plastic is solid at room temperature? Besides from the properties of materials that we use in everyday life, intermolecular forces is also very important in biochemistry. For example, without intermolecular force, our protein will not be able to fold properly. And if your proteins or your enzymes do not fold properly, they will not function. And so as it turns out, these intermolecular forces or attractive forces are determined by whether your molecule is polar or not. So let's first talk about how intermolecular forces determine some properties of a substance. Remember this different state of liquid and gas? Which state had more energy? The gas state, right? In order for a liquid to become a gas, you would have to give energy to this. Given enough energy to this substance, the molecules will break away from the attraction from each other to become gas molecules. Well, that attraction that we were talking about is in this section, intermolecular forces. If you have a high attraction to each other, you would need a lot of energy to break away to become a gas. If the molecules have high attraction to each other, you would have a higher boiling point. If they have a lower attraction to each other, they will have a lower boiling point. Same thing from going from solid to liquid. If they have a high attraction to each other, you would need a lot of energy, so higher melting point. If you have low attraction to each other, you would need lower heat, lower melting point. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at the attractive forces that exist between molecules. The first intermolecular force I want to talk about is called dipole-dipole attraction. To illustrate this point, let's take a look at two molecules, formaldehyde and ethane. These two molecules are good for comparison because they have the same mass and the same size, yet different melting temperatures. As you can see here, formaldehyde melts at 181 Kelvin, whereas ethane melts at about 101 Kelvin. Remember from last slide, what does it mean when something has a higher melting point? It must have some stronger attractive force, right? So what is attractive force? It turns out that attractive force is the dipole-dipole force. And it has a dipole-dipole force because it is a polar molecule. A polar molecule, remember, we can also call a dipole. And remember that I mentioned that dipoles are like magnets. And because they are like magnets, they are attracted to each other. So the more polar a molecule is, the stronger the attraction it will have with another polar molecule. And the stronger the attraction, the more energy it requires to pull them apart from one another, resulting in a higher melting point of their overall substance. Whereas if you're a nonpolar molecule, you're not magnets, you don't have that strong attraction to each other, so you don't need that much energy to pull them apart. That's why in the previous section we had to predict whether a molecule is polar or not. From that section, we did predict that formaldehyde was polar, whereas ethane is nonpolar, right? It has all nonpolar bonds, so all nonpolar bonds mean the whole molecule is nonpolar. Now let's take a look at another attractive force. This one is similar to a dipole-dipole attraction, but it's a very special type. So to see this attractive force at work, let's take a look at ethanol and dimethyl ether. Among these two molecules, which one possesses this attractive force, do you think? By looking at the boiling points here, ethanol has a higher boiling point. It has a higher boiling point, so it has higher attractive force. So what is this attractive force? It's not a dipole-dipole simply because both of these molecules are polar molecules. Well, so what is it then about ethanol that allows it to have a stronger attractive force? The answer to that is something called a hydrogen bond. And let's first give a definition. A hydrogen bond is when you have a hydrogen connected to a very electronegative atom, fluorine, oxygen, or nitrogen. that hydrogen, which is very partially positive now, is attracted to a lone pair, which is a region of high electron density. So for example, in the molecule of ammonia, where you have a nitrogen with 3 hydrogens, this hydrogen is connected to this nitrogen. But the nitrogen's electronegativity pulls the electron towards this way, so this hydrogen is basically partially positive. Actually, very partially positive. So much so that it is very attracted to the lone pairs that exist on this other nitrogen from the other molecule. This is called a hydrogen bond. It is not a real covalent bond like this bond, but it is an intermolecular bond, an intermolecular force. Inter, again, meaning between 2 molecules. This hydrogen bond also exists in water. Again, hydrogen connected to oxygen is very partially positive, so it is attracted to the lone pairs of another oxygen atom. Keeping in mind the hydrogen bond that forms from our water here, to apply it back to our previous example. In ethanol, do you see that hydrogen bond? So in ethanol, there is a hydrogen that is connected to an oxygen, whereas in dimethyl ether, there are no hydrogens connected to that oxygen. So therefore, this one cannot have hydrogen bonding. This one only has dipole-dipole, whereas this one has hydrogen bonding, which is a stronger force. And in fact, hydrogen bonding is what allows for proteins to fold properly. Without this hydrogen bonding, proteins in your body will not form shapes that bestows it different functions. And you will see a lot of this example when you take biochemistry courses in the future. Now I wanted to show you an example of such a protein. If you click on that link, it'll bring you to YouTube and you can see this protein at work. This is Kinesin. It is a protein that transports materials in your cell, and because of hydrogen bonding, it can have proper folding. And from the proper folding, it would have a proper structure, and without this proper structure, it can't do what it does, which is to walk along this microtubule in your cell and bring the material in different parts of your cell. So the protein that we're talking about is just this one here, and it's carrying this big cargo behind it. Alright, so you can go to that site if you want to see more of this video. It's pretty awesome. Okay, and the last intermolecular force we want to talk about is something called dispersion forces. Now, dispersion forces are the weakest among the 3, and every molecule has it. Even nonpolar molecules will have dispersion force. Every molecule will have it because they are caused by a temporary dipole. So even though you are nonpolar, that means you're not a dipole, you can be induced to become a dipole, not forever, but temporarily. And this happens when molecules bump into each other. And imagine when they bump into each other, even though the electrons are distributed evenly throughout the molecule, when they bump into each other, you can imagine the electrons being shifted and somehow being all on one side. And because the electrons are being on one side, it's partially negative, and on the other opposite end, it will be partially positive. So eventually, you essentially have a dipole. So you can imagine that you have a bunch of these nonpolar molecules, but for a split moment, they become a polar-like molecule. So they can be attracted to each other. The negative ends can be attracted to their positive ends, forcing this intermolecular force that we call dispersion forces. Although this force, because it's temporary, is very weak, does allow for liquids and solids to exist even for nonpolar molecules. Like the plastic that we talked about, plastic is basically made of carbon and hydrogen bonds, and we know carbon and hydrogen bonds are nonpolar bonds, so their molecule is very nonpolar. But yet it can still exist as a solid. And it turns out the reason for that is dispersion forces increases significantly based on the mass of the molecule. So in the plastic, it's called a polymer. It's actually very massive. So even though it is a nonpolar molecule, being so big of a molecule trumps it being a nonpolar molecule. You don't have to understand it at that level. It's something cool to understand. If you want to explore more, we can talk more. But the gist of this section is for you to understand that there are 3 types of intermolecular forces. We call them hydrogen bond, dipole-dipole, and dispersion. Hydrogen bonds are the strongest, followed by a dipole-dipole attraction, followed by the weakest is the dispersion forces. Hydrogen bonds occur only when you have a hydrogen connected to an oxygen, a nitrogen, or a fluorine, whereas a dipole-dipole attraction occurs when you have a polar molecule. When you have a nonpolar molecule, the only thing you have left is something called a dispersion force.